Okay, good morning. We're on page 87 in the Hemshech Tafresh Sadik Dalet, which is 5694 at the top of the page. And we reviewed yesterday the two examples that he uses for the leap of the tzimtzum. The tzimtzum that creates his chalkus, division, meaning distinct levels and diversity in the oir, in the energy. Because up to pre-tzimtzum, the energy is considered indivisible, seamless. So the tzimtzum is the way, obviously the koyach ha'atzmus, power of atzmus, the yechelus of atzmus to create diversity, but the actual process is the tzimtzum, and therefore the oir that comes after this leap, it's a leap. It's not a gradual progression. It's a leap. The oir that comes out of it is now it originates from the oir before the tzimtzum, but it's on a lower level, and it's now subject to the distinctions and details, with the example being of the two people studying a subject, and one offers a comprehensive and a powerful theory. He calls mole oir, filled with light, and it's geschmack. It's challenged by the other. The first one in turn goes back, returns and comes and goes back to the source of the idea, and then addresses it with a second step of explanation that now resolves the challenge. So this second step is the light after the tzimtzum. So number one, it comes after a pause, obviously, after a challenge by the tzimtzum, and it's a lower level. You can't compare the energy level, the intensity of the addendum, if you wish, or the footnote or the qualification to the original idea pre-tzimtzum. And it's now been broken down into details. And that's the details that come once you begin to dissect an idea. And that's the post-tzimtzum oir. So therefore, bottom line is that tzimtzum causes poil ba'ir akav, liyas b'chinas ischalkus b'chinas ma'ila mata. That's the last line we learned. So the tzimtzum impacts in the ir akav that it should be in a state of ischalkus. Not just diminished, not just ribuy amiyat, not just more light, less light, but actually a structure. And ma'ilomata, which is a hierarchy of that which is more intense, less intense. Well, the fizeh, we'll continue now. Line 5 on page 87. It's in ayinbeis.com if you want to follow the text and the PDF. It says, lo fizeh. According to this, we're now going back to explain the third interpretation, back on page 84, Shita Shlishis, and explaining the interface of the channel in between. So according to this, the Ayin, which is the interface between the Yesh Amiti, the true reality, true existence, uben Yesh Nivra, and the created existence, who er pnimi. According to this, we'll understand that both levels of ayin in that channel in between the interface are both in er pnimi. They're both in the immanent energy that is an energy that's permeating existence. V'hainu shu er akav. Remember, he said l'cheri yashlema b'pshitus. That was the way he began in Ayin Beis as well as in Tzadik Dalet. He said, but Pshitas, how do you explain it? It's both in the Kav. The Kav is the Erev Mamala, because the Kav is the paintbrush. It's the line, the thread that channels and regulates the distinctive energy. Remember, now it says Chalkus, it's distinctive energy. We discussed how that came to be. So that's the Kav. So now the Kav breaks into two levels, divides into two levels. So he's finishing now the topic that he began on page 84. That's the kav. And this internal energy, this energy that is directed toward existence, toward creation, divides into two. The b'chinas ma'ila shabai. Now that we've established that the kav has levels, the b'chinas ma'ila shabai, meaning the top, its highest level of the kav, that's attached and touches. I'm sorry, that touches and is attached to Erein Sof. That's the highest part of the kav. It's in a state of closeness because it's right there at the mouth of the well. It's right there at the beginning of the transmission. That level is called the ayin of the yesh amiti. Why? Because v'hainu shum l'maylim b'chinas mokal elemus. So even though in general the kav is coming after the tzimtzum, as we learned, and is impacted by the tzimtzum, but the other side of the kav is that it's connecting to the original svara, the original energy. It's higher than being a source to the worlds on that level. Ubchinas mata shabai, and the lower level in the kav. You break it in general, two levels. The lower, she'enan negei v'davuk be'erein sev baruchu. Like he explained on page 84 from the Eitz Chaim, that the top is attached, and as the kav goes downward, it gets more and more diminished because it's not attached below. And that's what creates the hierarchy. 1 minute. Yeah. She said that lower part, that does not touch and is not attached to the infinite divine light pre-tzimtzum. That's the ayin. That's the state of this channel, of this divine energy, which is like a state of ayin. That's what we're calling it. We'll soon explain what ayin means. Of the yesh hamasava, of the created, or the yesh that comes into being. So there you have the two levels of the ayin. The kav is the overall ayin. The higher part of the kav relates more to its source. The lower part of the kav relates more to existence. Umahai taima, and for this reason, the beginning of the formation and the coming into being of the containers is in the world of akudim, is akudim. Aval b'parts of ak, in the structure of ak, Adam Kadman, the primordial man, which is higher than akudim, ein sham kelim adayin. You don't yet have containers. Now we learned this already in Ayin Beis, so this is just a repeat of what we learned. It's going to explain why in a minute. What do you have in ak? Rak b'chinas shedish neshamas de gufus. In Ayin Beis, this was in the parentheses. Here he takes it out of the parentheses. You could only say an ak is the root of the neshamas of the bodies, as we discussed back when we learned Ayin Beis, preconception and conception. So there's a root for the neshamas that will come into the bodies. That's an ak, but you can't call it actual kelim yet. Why is that the case? Because this is a perfect manifestation, expression of hierarchy. A place which is higher than kelim, and a place where kelim develop. She said, "V'hainu lefi sheba'ak meir erakav k'moshe b'chinas dveikus mamish b'mkere." Ak is the first world created by the kav. So ak, what radiates in ak is the air, the light of the kav, even though it's the kav after the tzimtzum, but relatively speaking, is the light of the kav, the way it's attached, mamish attached to its source. So ak is very close to the source, to the original place where the kav emerged. And it's not yet proportional or commensurate that from there should be a metzias dover, something that actually is of substance. Obviously, we mean spiritual substance. A keli already indicates on identity, on a structure. So though the kav creates structure, but in the earliest stages, it's still very amorphous. Therefore, there's no kelim in an ak. V'rak ba'akudim, only in akudim, which is the next level. This is already as the kav has gotten a little more distance, meaning qualitative distance from its source. There's the beginning of the shaping and the formation and the coming into being of the container.
It's kli echad only. The SR spheres.
Right.
Kli echad.
Correct. But it's a container. It's called clay. It's called a keli, yeah. Like we spoke in conception, like one cell. The gamzeh, and also this, the is not just its nesachik, it's also through moti v'lei moti. As we talked about, moti v'lei moti is the early stages of Ratzeh v'shuv, the root of it, where it touches and it doesn't touch. It arrives and doesn't arrive. Negei v'lei negei is the way it's translated, I think, by the Tzemach Tzedek. So what is that? What's the moti v'lei moti add here? That it's not just the light has the minute. It's a light that's in a state of movement. Back to the source, out of the source, back to the source. It's like pulsating. But it's all within the source, which means the hainu aydei richel ka'er. Because that's what moti v'lei moti does. It creates the ability for something to be connected while also moving to the next level. So basically that in ak, yeah. So in ak, you don't yet have that. That's why there's no keli, because it's right close to the source. And the kelim begin when the begins to get more distant and more diminished. And through the moti v'lei moti that I just described, which again, all this is word for word from Ayin Beis, page 1150, I believe. What we've been learning, Aleph Kuf Nun. Yeah, Aleph Kuf Nun. I'm just looking for a moment. Just a minute. Okay. Good. So now, okay. So now we finished essentially the themes addressed on page 11, bottom of 1149, 1150 in Ayin Beis. The Frierdiker Rebbe added a lot more about the Hischalkus, but the general gist of the whole flow is the same idea. How an pnimi, which means the kav, the third interpretation that the ayin divides into two, is all within the kav. That's the simply said, the obvious, ostensible way of explaining how a mamala, the era mamala, you have the two levels. So now we have three interpretations. The first interpretation, which we learned earlier, is all before the tzimtzum. The ayin of the yesh hamiti is etzem ma'er. The ayin of the yesh hanivra is ispashta sa'er, which in itself has levels. That's interpretation number one, all pre-tzimtzum, all in the divine consciousness. Interpretation number two, it's seviv and mamala. Seviv is rooted before the tzimtzum, and also after the tzimtzum, it retains a transcendent quality that's above Kalim and above the Pnimi. That's the Ayin of Yesh Amiti. The Ayin of Yesh Hanivra is Mamala Kalam, is the air that relates to existence, which it emerges after the Tzimtzum. So in a way, interpretation number 2 is like pre-Tzimtzum, post-Tzimtzum. Okay. Interpretation number 3 is all post-Tzimtzum. All in Mamala itself, the 2 levels that we just learned. So it's 3 different, what the Frierdiker Rebbe calls shittas, 3 different approaches, and 3 approaches to the understanding the ayin. Now, however, if you remember in Ayin Beis, it didn't suffice with that. He said omnom afterwards. That's after this ostensible interpretation of the 2 levels of the kav. He said omnom. The emes, you have to say tzarich lemer, that just like before the tzimtzum, there's etzem and ispashtus, also post tzimtzum in mamala kalam, there's also etzem and ispashtus, and he's going to explain now the 2 levels of ayin in the 3rd interpretation itself in a deeper way. That's what we learned in Ayin Beis. Where we are right now in Tzadik Daled, we learned the first explanation in the 3rd interpretation, which is the kav. So we're going to continue now in Tzadik Daled, because we still have to finish the 2nd way of understanding the 3rd interpretation. As I just said, etzem and ispashtus. So we learned the core source material in Ayin Beis in chapter 11, page 1150. And now we're going to do a skip, because this is the end of a Maimer in Tzadik Daled. And you feel free to read it. It may help you, it may not, it may just confuse you. But I'm going to skip it. He says, "V'zeu b'yem shmini atzeres." The next line is the end of this discourse, and as we've done in the past, we'll skip the end, we'll skip the beginning of the next discourse, and we'll continue the hemshich. So I'm skipping now over, because remember this came out in Kuntresim. So besides the Maimer, end of the Maimer, there's also more pages afterwards: a sicha, a letter, minhagim. So it's quite a number of pages that we're going to skip now. So these came out in separate pamphlets. In the Hemshech, what's relevant to us, we go now to page 107. So it's 20 pages, but remember, we're not learning these 20 pages. So 87 to 107 is just a placeholder. In 107, what we'll do is we'll start the Lahavin Kol Zeh Tzarich Lahagdim. So the Frierdiker Rebbe is continuing in the same style of a Hemshech, adding beginnings and endings, but we're skipping the beginnings and endings. And I say it as an important disclaimer, we're not skipping it, God forbid, because it's not important. Obviously, it's part of the Hemshech, and you have to learn it regularly. But since we're really learning Ayin Beis, and this is only to help explain Ayin Beis, I felt it's fine that we don't have to go learn a whole new Hemshech with all the beginnings and ends, which is like a whole new series of learning. So though there's full of legitimacy to do so, but I'm going to go to the Lahavin Kol Zeh on page 107, and let's give you the lay of the land. This is now going to explain the 2nd way of understanding the 3rd interpretation as etzem and mishpashtus of mamala kalam, and this is going to take us to let me see where. I'm just looking where this continues. Yeah. Page 111 approximately is where we're going to go back to Ayin Beis, because he's going to finish this topic, and then we'll go back to the 2 levels of Ayin as he explains them there. Yeah, the top of page 112 to be precise. That's when we shall go back. I'll explain it when we get there. So now we're gonna have as a bonus a Frierdiker Rebbe summary of everything that's been learned. This is his summary at the beginning of, in the top of page 107. So I'm starting to read from Lahavin Kol Zeh. Lahavin Kol Zeh, Meaning, after asking questions on the Pasuk in Arech Lecha, which is the Noach Maimer from that year, it says to understand all this, Tzarech lahagdim tchila mashnas bar le'il. If to understand, we'll first have to preface that which was explained earlier. And what was explained earlier? The ba'ayin hamamutza ben yesh amiti v'yesh hamisavra, yesh hamisava, then the ayin hamamutza in that interface channel of ayin, that space of called ayin, nothingness, being between the true reality, yesh amiti, true existence, v'yesh hamisava and created existence, v'hanivra. Here he says yesh hamisava v'hanivra. Because remember, I explained, Mesava includes Atzilus, even things that are not technically called Nivroim. But everything that comes into existence goes through this ayin, and the Yesh HaMesava V'Anivra. He says, in this ayin, Yesh Gimel Shittas. So here we go, he's going to sum it up. There are three approaches, three ways of explaining it. Shita Aleph, the Klolos Ayin or Erein Sof Shalifnei Atzimtzum. The first approach is that the ayin is what is the level? It's Eid Ein Sof before the tzimtzum. The ayin is chalik l'shnayim, and that Eid before the tzimtzum divides into two. Haim, kolim. This is not so common in my modim, so he makes a kolim. What are the two levels of ayin before the tzimtzum interpretation? One, shita aleph, etzem eir v'hispashtus eir. The core energy and the expression of the energy, or the extension of the energy. The etzem hu ayin yesh amiti. The core energy, which is only as a reflection of the source, it doesn't have yet a hamshacha v'gilui, meaning it's not yet extending and relating to anything. All it is reflecting its source. That's the ayin of the yesh amiti. The hispashtus eir, the air that begins to extend and express, where there will emerge the ratzon, the Ratzon Klali, the Ratzon Prati, and Ratzon HaKodim, the three levels of Ratzon we learned. That's who Ayin the Yesh HaMesava. That's the Ayin, the second level of Ayin, in that general Ayin, the second level, the Ayin of the created Yesh, or the Yesh that comes into the existing, the one that was brought into being. That's the first Shitta. He's not elaborating, it's just a summary. Shitta HaBeis, the second approach, that Beis Madregas Ba'ayin, the two levels of Ayin, Hini B'chlolusam, in general, Heim Tseviv V'Mamala, transcendent and immanent. The B'sharsham, what's in their root? Hu Klolos Er Shalifnei Atzimtzum, is the general light before the Tzimtzum, Shahu Ayin Di Yesh Amiti. Because remember, the root of Seviv is Be'etzem before the Tzimtzum. That's the Ayin of the Yesh Amiti, of the true Yesh. For Eid HaKav, which comes after the Tzimtzum, Shua Ayin the Yesh HaMesava V'Anivra. That's the Ayin that relates to the Yesh that comes into being and the created existence. Two, V'Shita Shlishis. And the third approach, the Klolos Ayin Hu Er Pnimi. The general Ayin, all of it is Er Pnimi. Ulocheira, here's the Locheira. Hu Er HaKav. Seemingly, the best way to explain, that's the Kav, Mamala. Sheyesh Boi Mailo Mata. It has a higher and lower level. Ayin Beis B'chinas Ayin. And those are the two levels of Ayin. The Ktseyu HaElyon Negei V'Davik Be'ed Ein Sof. Hu Ayin Diyesh Amiti. The top edge, the top of the Kav, which touches and is attached to Eid Ein Sof. That's the Ayin of the Yesh HaMiti. The Ktseu HaTachten, and the edge below, the bottom part of the Kav, Shemisrachik Memkere, which has distanced itself from its source. It's traveled and become diminished. Hua Ayin the Yesh HaMesava. That's the Ayin that relates to the Yesh HaMesava, to the Yesh that comes into being, the created Yesh. So he basically summed it up for us, very clear. You could always go back to this if you ever want a summary. Three. So it's interesting. One is all the Tzimtzum. One is a combination of Seviv Mamal. and the second is all in mamala. The third interpretation, it's all in mamala. Okay, we continue on now. Chapter 22 in the Hemshech Tzadik Dalet. This is again exact language from Ayin Beis. Let me just again give you the overview, which we learned. He's now going to say let me correct. However, the qualification that the truth, this third interpretation is not just the kav, it's even higher than the kav. It's the overall Eir HaMamala. We'll understand that in a few moments. In truth, you have to say, that Shita Ashlishis. Remember, Shita is the Frierdiker Rebbe's addition. The Rebbe Rashab doesn't use the word Shita. He just says it as another way of understanding it. So Frierdiker Rebbe is saying, this third approach, what was the third approach? In the inyan of the Yesh Amiti, the Ayin, the channel in between a true reality and created reality, which is Er Pnimi, that's the third interpretation. Hine HaKavanahu, the intention of this is the Kashem Sheba Er Shalifnei at Simsum. He's going to say now, Kavan is not just the Kav. The Kav is a good interpretation, it's fine. That's the ostensible interpretation. But broader speaking, just as we spoke in the first approach, I'm just spelling it out before we read it inside, that there were two levels in the first approach. What did we learn? Two levels, Etzem Ha'er, Hispashtus Ha'er, all before the Tzimtzum. He's saying the same thing. We can now talk about Mamala Kalam, and there's the Etzem of Mamala Kalam and the Hispashtus of Mamala Kalam, which is a broader take than the beginning of the Kav and the end of the Kav. That's what he's going to be saying now. As I said, we learned it on page 1150. So maybe new to you, or maybe not. If you remember, we discussed it at length. I will explain it obviously again in the language of the Frierdiker Rebbe because he adds to it. But that's where he's going right now. So he's giving a much broader about Mamala in general. So what does he say? So Kavana, the truth is the Kavana is just as the Eir before the Tzimtzum, the pre-Tzimtzum Eir, Hainu ba'Eir HaBligvul, which is the Eir HaBligvul, not Gvul. Remember, Mamala is the Eir HaGvul because it's commensurate. Mamala fits and relates to whatever it's going into. The Eir HaBligvul, he said, what do we learn about it? He says, so Kavanu Shem Sheber Shalifnei Etzem Hainu ba'Eir HaBligvul Ukanal, as we learned earlier. The Rebbe in the footnote says chapter 21, which means last chapter. The Lifnei Tzimtzum HaBligvul Biz Gabrus. Remember, we learned the purpose of the Tzimtzum was two things: to cause the Bligvul to recede or to be concealed, so you can allow for existence for another entity, identity to emerge, and it impacts the midah v'gvul that the air should come in a measured way. So what did we learn? We learned that before the Tzimtzum, Bligvul was dominant, Biz Gabrus. It was like a vast, infinite ocean of Eir Ein Sof. So that's Eir Ein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum. U'makom mokim harigam ba'er zeh yesh b'chinas etzem v'hispashtus. And nevertheless, as we learned in the first interpretation, that in this Eir, though it's Bligvul, there are two levels: etzem, the core energy, v'hispashtus, and the extension or expression of the energy. The b'chinas etzem ha'er hu k'moya etzem. That the etzem ha'er we learned was like the etzem. It was a reflection of the etzem. The kashem she'etzem ein b'chinas hispashtus. Just as the core is not in a state of extension, v'amshoche, and extension and expression or transmission, expression, extension and transmission, v'amshoche be'etzem, that fundamentally it's not something that can be transmitted. Kain hugam be'etzem ha'er. He's going over what we learned about etzem and hispashtus before the tzimtzum. He's going to then, this sentence is going to conclude. So the same thing is in Mamala, there's also etzem and hispashtus. But we didn't get to the end yet. So that's why the niggin is still lifting. And then there's the second level we learned. Ub'chinas hispashtus, shusha b'chinas hamshocha. And then there's the level of extension, which is already a state of transmission. Actually, this niggin I can't keep up because now he's going to go into a whole discussion of etzem and ispashtus. But I will just point out to you, this is going to be an addition that's not an Ayin Beis. So then he's going to say, I'm just jumping just to show you the end of this phrase, of this clause, so to speak. He's going to say like this. Hine kain hu. So this end is going a long way. It's almost 3/4 of a page. If you look on the next page, 108, if you read on the line that starts, Harikol mashu nimshach yesu mismayit b'amshachosei, look at the next line. Hine kamoishu be'etzem ispash livnet tzimtzum hainu b'ashita aleph. Same thing he's going to say is in the third interpretation. So the end of this opening is going to be the middle of next page. Meanwhile, he's going to explain now etzem and ispashtus in more detail. But the point that he's leading to, he wants to say that in the third interpretation of pnimi, you can apply the same principle. Just like has the core energy, that's just being a reflection of its source. And number two, as it relates to some function, the same thing in pnimi. There's the core energy of pnimi, which is just a reflection of source to be a hagvul. That's what God wants it to be. And there's the functionality of Mamal Kalaman. And those are going to be the two levels of Ayin in the third interpretation, which is a broader explanation than the Kav itself. I just wanted to give the overview because we shouldn't get lost in the details. But I'm going to go back now and read on page 107. But that's the flow. So Kamoy Shahu, this is the Omnam. Omnam, just in truth, the third interpretation we can learn from the first interpretation. Not that it's the same level, but just like there's two levels in there's two levels in of Mamala. That's the flow. So now let's go further and see what he's going to say here. So now he's going to go a little deeper, and this is the Frierdiker Rebbe's addition to explaining the etzem and ispashtus sa'er before the tzimtzum. Well, one more line that came from earlier in Ayin Beis. So we have etzemer. That's all it is reflect. It's not even. It's just like the etzem. It's not in a flowing mode yet. It's basically just the idea that the etzem is now begilui. That's it. The second is the air. Is the Pashto says the air is beginning to have a function. It would be like saying the sunlight. That is just the light that the sun has sunlight in it. We're not talking about this light already being transmitted to come to spread out and to Earth or to other planets or to the solar system. It's the idea that the sun is not just the sun is now giving off light. So it's a reflection of the source. That's all its role is at that point. His pashtus is the focus is on the functionality of this light. Its expression, its extension, its transmission. So now he's saying like this. And in Spashtus, that's where it's shaykh to say, in Spashtus, we could say that it's diminishing. The mere concept that the sun has light is not subject to diminishment, because just like the sun exists, the sun gives off light. But in light, as it begins its function, which is to spread and to extend and to transmit, that's where the sunlight gets diminished in the process. So obviously, if you had symptom, you can't talk about physical diminishment or even a conceptual diminishment. It's just the idea that within the divine consciousness, the Eibishter God is beginning to define what he wants. I want a world, like we spoke in this Pasha said, I want a world, I want a home, and what the details of the home and all that comes before creation, before the building of the home. So that's Etzemer is Pasha said, the two levels of Ayin in the first interpretation. Now comes more explanation of what that is. So he says like this. Dihine Etzev is Pashtus, core and extension, the core of something, the essence of something, and its expression or extension or spreading out. Yuvan b'klaluse k'moy habeis meichin chachma bina. It could be understood in general by understanding, by looking into the two meichin of chachma and bina. So we know chachma is the spark of the idea, the flash, and bina is the development of the idea. So he's comparing etzem and his pashtus to chachma and bina to help us understand it a bit. Remember, there's no chachma and bina before the tzimtzum. So all this is really an explanation to understand etzem and his pashtus a bit more. So he's going to explain now. The chachma hi nekuda. Chachma is a dot, a point, meaning it's just a concentrated point. V'chol nekuda einu nimsheches. And a point, by definition, does not extend, or else it stops being a point. In mathematics, when you say point, line, plane, once it's a line, it's many points. It's not a point anymore. So then the definition of point is that it's not extended. It's just a point. It says, kol nekuda einu nimsheches. Does not extend, does not express. Which is like similar to what we was talking about. Etzem, there's no hamshach. U'kamoy hamayon, like a mayon, like a wellspring. The mayon is referring to, these are live well springs under the ground, like a living, like a well. So what's a well? A well is connected through different channels and arteries to the deepest parts of under the earth, which we're not going to get into now. The Chassidus talks about a tohim, a mayon, and a nar. I might as well spell it out. A tohim is like, tohim means the depths. It's referring to the source of all water that's beneath the crust, beneath everything. A mayon is already a body of water. However, it's a very small body. It's connected to the tohim, and it's a living. Usually a mayon is a mayon chai, a living water. So that's like, we call it a wellspring, spring. And nar is the water that comes from the mayon, but the nar is not necessarily attached. It can be just a channel of water that spreads out, and that's the water we associate with most. And it's not considered a mayon, even though it comes from a mayon. So a mayon is usually, as he's going to say, it gives off water drop by drop. A mayon at its root is not a large body of water. When you see the live mikvahs, like the Rizal's mikvah, you're already seeing the water as it's being drawn from the mayon. It's connected to it. That's why it's called Mayim Chaim. But a mayon itself is a deep underwater, underground water that's dripping drop by drop. That's how mayonis work. So on one hand, it's completely connected to the source. That's why it's a living water. On the other hand, it doesn't have expression and extension in a broad sense, which is what he's going to say now. The mayon being like chokhmah, and the nahar, the chevas hanar, is bina. So here's what he says. Like a mayon. A mayon is not an extension. You can draw water from a mayon. Like we have, you have a well underground, you dig a well, a be'er, like Avram did, and you draw water from it. But it itself, without you drawing, lies in its own original space somewhere under the ground. Different mayonis. Always been. And once you say, Mekivan here means like, Mekivan, and due to the fact, Shamayim Yetzim in Amayim Kvar Hem Nor. Once the water is coming out of the Maya, then it's already a state of a Nor, a river. Remember, river doesn't always mean the way we understand the river is like the River Jordan or the Euphrates River Euphrates and so on. It doesn't necessarily mean here a full-blown river. He means to say it's a body of water that's flowing that we can relate to. So he says that's already called a Nahar. So Mayan and Nahar. In context of Hilchas Mikvahs, for example, so we know there is a mikveh, you could bathe in a mikveh, immerse yourself in a Nahar. It doesn't have to be connected to the living water. We use a regular mikveh. It's not a nard, but it's a body of water that came from rainfall and has been now isolated. When the things that need tara from Mayim Chaim, like the Tumas Mess, there you cannot suffice with a river water. You have to have a water that's connected, Mayim Chaim, to a living wellspring. So whole halach is just on this itself. So he's saying the difference is, therefore, is he's saying, is not the difference between mayon and nar. It goes like this. V'chochmeh nikra mayon. The chochmeh is called mayon, wellspring. It's a source. Lies, why? The chochmeh ikra she nekuda v'nekuda einin nimsheches. Because the primary function, the primary role of chochmeh is not expression. It's not extension. It's just getting a kernel, a drop, a spark of truth that's coming from some higher place. That's what a chochmeh is about. It's not about explanation, development. It's the spark, the conception of an idea, like a drop. That's what it is. And its role is really actually more about truth of the idea than about explanation of the idea. We learned this at length in volume 1, how chochmeh is connected more to resonance, riyah, like a sense of truth. And I've quoted this a number of times in Tanya Perek Lamed Hey, where he speaks about in the Haggadah there, he says, Shamaiti Memedei. Alter Rebbe says, a few times he mentions in Tanya, I heard from my teacher, meaning the Magid, that chochmeh, that Ein Sof resides in chochmeh. Why? Because chochmeh is hulavade, is margish hulavade ve'ein zulase. Chochmeh senses that he alone and nothing else. He senses the uniqueness, exclusivity of godliness. Bina, he doesn't say this, but by contrast, Bina is already my understanding of it. So I remember our Mashpim told us, Chochmeh, the focus is that the truth resonates. That Inyan is emes, and Bina is ich versteh. Chochmeh is that the idea is understood, and Bina says, I understand it. So Chochmeh, the focus is on the truth of the idea, the source. And Bina, the focus is on you understanding it. Both are necessary, but they're very different relationship. Or the way I heard once from Rav Melech, he said to me, Chochmeh, der Inyan nemt the mensch, and Bina, the mensch nemt the Inyan. Translated means like this. Chochmeh, the idea absorbs you. And in Bina, you absorb the idea. It's a very different experience. So Chochmeh, by definition, is not about how smart and how developed and how brilliant the idea is. It's about the eichus, the quality of the truth and the resonating truth of the idea. Emes, hulavade ve'ein zulase. The truth of godliness, not the understanding of it. So in Seichel itself, in other words, there's two parts. There's the resonating truth, which is the real purpose of intelligence, and then there's the comprehension of it, which is also necessary. It's just a different step. One is not subject to Hamshach and Spashtus. It's not about extending. Chacham is a person who conceives ideas. You see people who are great at conceiving ideas. They may be very bad at developing ideas. In many companies, we've talked about this. You have people who are brilliant idea people. You ask them to break it down, to execute it, to figure out the details. They're not for that. Then there are people who don't come up with the idea, but give them an idea and they run with it. They flesh it out and develop it and the details and details. Now, you can't build anything without the second one, Tabina. But you can't build anything without Chachma. Chachma is where it all begins. So Chachma's focus is basically on the reality check of the quality of the core idea, like a mayon. It's concentrated. And Bina is about expression and expansion, explaining it, breaking it into detail, etc. She says like this. The Chachma in the Kuda, v'chol nekuda ein nimsheches. Oh, I know. I already read that. Sorry. Chochma nikra mayan li is the chochma ikra shi nekuda. The nekuda ein nimshachis. Chochma is a nekuda. And you want it to be that way. When someone comes up with an idea, you don't want to hear 5 pages. You want it to be one line. This is the idea. Concentrated. It's not fleshed out. You can't build it yet. But you have the core essence, and that's why Chassidus gives advice that very often when you go into Bina stage and you start developing, you can sometimes forget your point of departure, and you need to go back to Chachma. I always tell people when you start writing a plan, always make sure that the first line is prominent on top. So whenever you go off, the reality check, make sure it's aligned with your original concept, because it's very easy to go into 50 directions. You're learning an Indian, it's so many different, it branches off in so many places. What keeps it honest, so to speak? So a connection back to the original Nekuda of Chachma. What was the original point? Okay. You'll see good teachers, good speakers, good writers are very good at this. They know what their core point is. So even when they go into explanation and examples and details, they always will bring it back that you'll never lose sight of what was the point. What's the bottom line? What are we talking about? And it's very easy to get distracted because it's all intelligence, but it may be off point. And point is the exact word I want to use. Point, off point. You need the nekuda ha'emes, nekuda that it all began from. Okay. Ubina nikra nar, and Bina is called a river. It's called river. Va'nor ime yeshi yesh be mayonis, and a river, even though it has within it mayonis, because under the river you could have wells, or somewhere the wells that originate the water comes from. V'nimsheches, ime yeshi yesh be mayonis. V'nimsheches be'erech rav, and the river extends. It could be a very long river. Vihi amuka, and it's deep. So 3 things he's saying here. It has mayonis within it, meaning the original chachma. It extends long, and it's also deep. A river can be very deep. A river is not shallow necessarily. Aval ikar milas hanor, but the main quality of the nor, the main feature, shu bisrachvus gdela, that it's very wide. So he talks to them, we write here now 4 things. Mayon, length, depth, but he said the main thing is width, expansiveness. It's expansion. In a sense like horizontal expansion, not vertical. V'cheinu b'keich habina. And same is with the power, the faculty of bina. Shehi is pashtus. Its function, in contrast to Chochmah, is spashtus. Spashtus means expansion, to expand outward. I'll explain, but let's see what he says, and then we'll see if we need to explain. That's why the inyan of Bina is arichus hahesber dafke, a lengthy explanations dafke. That's what Bina is elaborate and comprehensive explanation of the nekuda, of the idea. Lefaret kol nekuda sichlis, to break down in details the nekuda sichlis, that spark of seichel, that nekuda. Ulachal kol libi chalokim, and to divide it and separate it into many different details. It's very reminiscent of what we learned the last class about the second friend. When they're learning together, what he does to him. I'm just saying, it just came to mind that there was a general idea, the theory, and he challenges it, and that causes it to come down to details. I'm not saying it's connecting to the 2. I'm just mentioning that. Okay? So this has been lefaret kol nekuda sichlis or lechalkol l'ribe chalokim. So lefaret means not just a general idea, but lefaret, let's spell it out specifically and break it down into many different parts. So, for example, someone says, okay, I want to build a home. That's Chochmah. Bina will take that idea and then start creating a whole blueprint, a structure. What kind of home, details, and all the specifics. Same thing with any idea. Somebody says, okay, you know what? I have a great concept of how to fight COVID-19. Some idea comes to mind. I had a cockamamie idea in the beginning when I saw that people were losing their sense of smell. And they were saying it was coming through the nose and through the mouth, that maybe we have to find some type of keteris. Because the Alter Rebbe, based on Zohar, based on the Posuk in Keirach, that Teyotzer HaMagefa was brought through keteris, through incense, by Keirach. How did they stop the Magefa, the epidemic? So I don't know, I told the doctor, I said, maybe you have to look at something that's not ingested. Maybe it's something that goes through the nose. Some nasal solution. I don't know if they ever looked into it. So it was my brilliant idea. I didn't patent it. But that's chokhmah. When you start breaking it down, you find out maybe the whole idea doesn't make sense. It's true. But let's say it would make sense. But it's just an idea. It's like a flash of it's a brainstorm. It's just a spark. Bina takes an idea.
Is from Alter Rebbe a way how to stop the magay for a whole.
That's what I just said.
There is.
Yeah. Yeah, in the beginning of the pandemic, I spoke about it at length. There's a whole thing from the Alter, but it's not the Alter, it's before the Alter. The Arizal writes Arichas about it. Zohar, there's a whole story about it, and it's based on the Pasuk in Keirach. Yeah. Okay, point being here is that Bina is Ispastus. Ulechein in Yonu hi Arichas Hasber, the Farid kol nekudesichus, ulechalko l'ribe chilokim. V'kol chelik l'ribe anofim. B'gdorim miyuchadim. Okay, Friedrich Rebbe in his classic way is spelling everything out in a Binadika way. Every part you further break down into many branches. B'gdorim miyuchadim. Each one with their own domain, with their own realms. So you started with something that was a nakuda. You started more detail, branching it into a whole structure with branches and gdorim and so on. The chol onof v'onof, every branch and branch, every one of these branches, who geder miyuchad, is a particular geder, is a particular parameter. This is all what Bina does. He's explaining it's hispastus, it's archava, it's expansion. So depth is not about expansion. Depth is understanding it very deeply. Length, I don't know if he's going to talk about Eirach here, but length is not expansion either. Length is showing how the idea leads to other ideas and goes on and can explain many things, Maven Dover, Metech Dover, and so on. Rechev, what he's speaking here, is expansiveness, taking the idea and breaking it into so many details and gedarim, and branching it off, and each gather and each part of it. It's like really a full-blown system. Like, for example, it says in the Torah, Lo yisasa malach. You're not allowed to do malach on Shabbos. Fine. It's a very short statement. What does that mean? What does malacha mean? So then we learn from the Lamates malachas because of the hekesh, from the Zeta, from the closeness of the smichas haparshis of Shabbos to Mishkan, that the 39 malachas is the 39 things they did in the Mishkan. Then you start the whole Gemara Masechta Shabbos. What's Lamates malachas? You have Ovis malachas, Aviaves malachas, Ovis, Tuldas. You start breaking it down, and you end up having a whole elaborate Hilchos Shabbos that covers everything. Every one of the Lamates malachas has how many branches? Who knows? It just branches and branches. So when you know Hilchos Shabbos properly, it all started with one thing. On the holy day of Shabbos, you're not supposed to do mundane work. That's an akudah. And Bina takes it and creates a whole structure out of it with different details. And remember, one malach has nothing to do with the next. Hilchos, let's say, Havara, carrying, Rishus, is very different than Hilchos, let's say, Bishul, cooking, or weaving. So each one has its own particular geder, and that geder breaks into more gedarim. That's what he's saying. I'm just giving you an example. So you take one nakuda, and they all are part of that nakuda. It all goes back to that one pasuk, or the psukim that talk about not the Isur Malacha for Shabbos. But now it's a whole elaborate system with a whole different categories. And there are people who are experts in some halach Hilchos Shabbos, and others are experts in other halachas. Very many details. So it goes on. So Chol Onav Onav Ugeder Meyuchad is its own parameter. V'Chol Onav L'Ribui Seifim, mamish like a Shulchan Aruch, a siman. Well, no, first a general halach, the Hilchos Shabbos, siman Reish Chafal, whatever. Then comes in each siman there's a sifim, and in sifim we know there's more details. So he says every branch, L'Ribui Sifim, in many little sections. Let's call it sections. Ubechol sif kama svaris, and in every section, number of theories, meaning different ideas, which is what we see. Ubechol svara kama ponim shenim, and in every theory, many different angles. Ponim shenim meaning different approaches. Bechelke habeina v'haseser. Chelke habeina v'haseser means in general, as you build a theory, you present the theory and then you contradict the theory. I think that's what he means by Chelke habeina v'haseser. I'm almost sure. He's not talking about Hilchos Shabbos, that's for sure. Even though I gave that example. I think he means habeina v'haseser, as you build an idea, that's what he says. Kama ponim shenim, you have ponim, I say shivim ponim l'teira, there's an expression. 70 faces, facets. Facet is the right word. So different facets, which means different angles. The chelke habeina v'haseser is an expression, I think, in intellectual development. As you build it and you and break it down until you really get it into a final stage. So Bina is all of this. Shekol zeh. Next page, 108. I'll just read one more line. I want to just finish this. Hu inyana shel Bina. All this is the inyan of Bina. By the way, you can mark this down. He really spells out Bina here in full glory. And the whole expansion of Bina. So all this is Bina. Lefaret called Dover, called Dvar HaSogel, Levarere Ulelavne. To Lefaret, to specify the details of every comprehension. Levarere, to clarify or to separate, clarify. Ulelavne, to crystallize. Lavne comes from the word leven, like to crystal clear, to crystallize the idea. Ulechein nikras recheves hanor. And that's why Bina is called recheves hanor. Recheves means the width, expansion of the river. Like you say, it's banks. It's a wide, the width of the river. Kamoy al derech moshel. Okay, you know what? I think we should stop here because now he's going to go into a longer explanation what a river is about. And just for the record, the Rebbe often, when he explained the Alter Rebbe and the Mittler Rebbe, he says it's Chacham and Bina, that the Alter Rebbe relatively was Nekudas, and the Mittler Rebbe would take one page of the Alter Rebbe and turn it into 10 pages in his Maimorim. That's why the Rebbe called Bina Recheves Hanor of the Mittler Rebbe. We'll talk about it some more. But the bottom line is, all this is coming to explain Etzem and Ispashtus in Oir, in the Oir before the Tzimtzum, and then we're going to explain the same thing in the Oir after the Tzimtzum, in the Oir Pnimi. So that's where we are, what we're in the middle of right now. So he's using Chochmah and Bina as an explanation of Etzem and Ispashtus. So one is completely defined by its pristine, pure, concentrated kernel, and the other one is defined by expansion, as we just said, in detail and breaking it down and in every possible way, developing the idea and fleshing it out in the fullest sense of the word. So we'll stop here on top of page 108.